NIFTY's Targeted PD Seminar Series. The purpose of these seminars is to provide a review in content, instructional activities, and share NIFTY best practices. These seminars are useful for teachers who have recently gone through NIFTY University, as well as veteran teachers looking for content and teaching refreshers. On this webinar, we will discuss secondary versus primary market research. By viewing the seminar, you will be able to explain the importance of market research, distinguish between primary and secondary research, and identify NIFTY best practices and suggestions for teaching and having students perform secondary and primary research. Before our discussion of primary versus secondary research, let's review NIFTY's units of learning. Students learn about primary versus secondary research in Chapter 7, Section 1 of the 11th edition textbook. This falls in our second unit of learning. However, being able to distinguish between and ultimately perform primary and secondary research will inform the entirety of students' business plans. Take a moment to review the learning objectives for the market research unit of learning. You may notice that using primary and secondary sources to determine market size is explicitly outlined in the first objective. In addition, having a knowledge of how to perform primary and secondary research affects all of the other objectives in this unit. Students cannot gather information on their target market, competition, or market trends without a basic understanding of how to undergo actual primary and secondary research. Furthermore, without a foundation of primary and secondary research, students will not be able to complete the financials or marketing sections of the business plan. Now let's review the content of primary versus secondary research. To start our conversation on primary versus secondary research, let's review the case study we were introduced to during NIFTY University, Ava's Edibles. If you recall, Ava Tan was thinking about starting a personal chef business in Columbus, Ohio. Like many of your students, she had a good idea, but not much direction on where to start in the research process. That is where the concept of primary versus secondary research comes in. At the start of any research cycle, one must first list the questions that the entrepreneur is looking to answer through the research. Once the questions are listed, it's important to identify which research type will be beneficial in answering each question. Let's take a look at each type of research before helping Ava with her questions. The 11th edition textbook defines secondary research as obtaining existing information that was purposely gathered for a purpose other than a study at hand. Students can access secondary data through government sites, trade groups and journals, business magazines and reports, and local community resources such as a Chamber of Commerce. In contrast, the textbook defines primary research as obtaining new information that is collected for a particular purpose. It is obtained directly from potential customers. Primary data can be collected through interviews, surveys, focus groups, and observations. It's also important to note that while the naming convention may be confusing for students, secondary research usually comes before primary research. This is because secondary research already exists and is easier to access. Primary research needs to be done when the data does not already exist in some form. Let's return to Ava's questions that she's looking to answer through her market research. By understanding the difference between secondary and primary research, she can not only categorize her research questions, she can also easily put together a plan for potential resources for her research. For example, the first and third question are found through secondary research because the data is readily accessible through government websites. For the second and fourth questions, direct questioning of potential customers is required, so those would be answered through primary research. Note, it may be possible for a question to be answered through a combination of both types of research. As an example, we have what type of certification is needed to be a personal chef. That might include looking for information on existing websites or talking to people for your own specific needs. This is normal and completely fine. However, when introducing this topic, we recommend choosing examples that are clearly one or the other so students can differentiate between the two. Once they can identify the types of research and the different sources, they can then tackle hybrid questions for their own business plans. When teaching students about primary versus secondary research, it's important to keep in mind the ultimate goal is to not just have them categorize examples of research types, but to actually get them to do their own research. Therefore, it's very important to teach primary versus secondary research in the context of the larger market research cycle. Understanding primary versus secondary research directly impacts the first 3 steps of the research cycle. By having students identify their objectives, they can clearly categorize their objectives as ones that will be answered through primary research or secondary research. Then they can determine if they will use secondary, primary, or a combination of both to answer each of their research questions. Understanding what primary and secondary resources are out there is also important for gathering data. Finally, many teachers ask for specific websites for students to access quick information about this process. While NIFTY provides many suggestions in the program guide, it's important that students struggle and find the information for themselves. If they want to know the answer to a question that is not online, they may be required to call and ask somebody. This will provide them with transferable problem-solving and research skills. When teaching the concepts of primary versus secondary research in the NIFTY classroom, it's important to follow the instructional flow set out by the NIFTY instructional method. Starting with experiential activities like Ava's Edibles case study and the chocolate bar activity will expose students to categorizing and performing primary and secondary research, while connecting to their prior knowledge. Teachers can then use Chapter 7.1 and supplemental materials to formally introduce the content to students. Students should see case studies and investigate model business plan exemplars for guidance. Teachers can formally assess how students are doing by administering Performance Task 2A and reteaching where necessary. Students should then apply their understanding of primary and secondary research to their own business plans as the ultimate demonstration of learning. Here are the next steps to close out this session. Reread Chapter 7.1 for more content review. Review the primary versus secondary research PowerPoint from NIFTY University. That's Day 2, PowerPoint 1. Look through the experiential activities and assessments for additional support. The experiential activities specifically have grade modifications and extension activities. And finally, ask your program manager or staff for additional support as needed.